Hi everyone, welcome back. This is video 2 now for this week, and we're talking about deontology. So in the last video, we looked at trolley problems and a couple different trolley problem cases. And in this video, we're going to talk about a moral theory and talk a little bit about what it says about the trolley problem cases. So deontology is, maybe it's a moral theory, but it's really better to think about it as a category of moral theories. Deontology is the view that an action is right or wrong purely based on whether or not that action obeys certain rules. So deontology reduces morality to following or not following certain moral rules. If there's a rule not to kill, then it's always morally wrong to kill. If there's a rule not to lie, then it's always morally wrong to lie, etc. And so right and wrong, therefore, have nothing to do with the consequences of your actions. So if morality is just a matter of what rules you're following, if an action is good whenever it follows certain rules, then whether or not the action is good doesn't depend on what effects the action actually has. So for example, in the trolley problem, the lever case, the original trolley problem, you might think that you should pull the lever in order to make only one person die rather than having 5 people die. One death is a better outcome than 5 deaths. Death is bad, more deaths is worse. 5 deaths is worse than 1 death. So you might think you should pull the lever so that only one person has to die rather than 5 people having to die. But if morality is just a matter of following the right rules, then the fact that 5 deaths is a worse outcome than 1 death doesn't matter for what you should or shouldn't do. Which of these outcomes, the 5 death outcome or the 1 death outcome, is the better outcome isn't the point, according to deontology. The question is, what are the moral rules? Does pulling the lever follow or obey those moral rules? Or does doing nothing follow those moral rules? If there's a moral rule against causing someone to die, for example, if there's a moral rule against killing someone, and if pulling the lever counts as killing someone, then deontology says you can't pull the lever. Or a deontological view will say you can't pull the lever under any circumstances. Whether pulling the lever would save 5 lives, 10 lives, a billion lives. If pulling the lever amounts to killing someone and there's a rule against killing anyone, then you can't pull the lever. And so what actions obey or disobey the moral rules, the correct moral rules, is all that matters in morality. Making sure that you're following the moral rules is enough, is all you need in order to act morally. And violating the moral rules means you were acting immorally. Even if you thought you were breaking the rules for a good reason, you were still acting immorally, according to deontology. If you're following the moral rules, you're acting morally. If you're violating the moral rules, you're acting immorally. And that's it. That is the end of that story, as far as deontology is concerned. An action can be morally right, even if everything turns out terribly. If there's a rule against lying and you could tell a lie to spare someone's feelings, deontology says sparing their feelings is morally wrong in that case because it's lying and there's a rule against lying. Now, maybe there's not a rule against lying. Maybe that's not one of the right moral rules. Deontology doesn't really tell you, or being a deontologist by itself doesn't tell you what the moral rules are. Deontology is just the view that whatever the moral rules turn out to be, being a good person is just obeying those rules. That's all there is to morality. And that's why there are lots of different deontological views, because there are lots of different ways you can think, or lots of different sets of rules you can think are right. So let's look at an example in the bridge version of the trolley problem. Most deontologists, so remember, there are different kinds of deontologists because there are different rules you can think are right. Some deontologists think there's a rule against lying. Some deontologists think there isn't, and they'll have different answers about what you can or can't do, morally speaking. But they'll both agree that obeying moral rules is all that matters. So in the bridge version of the trolley problem, most deontologists think you should not push the big person off the bridge because they think there's a moral rule that you should not kill innocent people. Killing innocent people is bad. You should not kill innocent people. And shoving a person off the bridge to their death is killing them. Pushing people off bridges to their death is against moral rules. And so it would be wrong to do that, even if it would save more lives. Even though pushing the person off the bridge means only one person dies instead of 5 people dying, it would still be wrong. That's the usual deontological view. So deontologists think that you can't violate moral rules, even if violating moral rules would in some sense bring about a better outcome, would make the world a better place. If you would just break the moral rules, if you would just kill this one person, you could save so many more lives. Deontologists will say you still can't kill that one person because killing that one person is morally wrong. It violates the moral rules. And so deontologists usually take intentions to matter. Why you're doing something matters. And this is largely due to the influence of a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And there are these moral rules, and you need to intend to follow the rules and intend not to break them. Rules like don't lie, or don't break promises, or don't kill innocent people. These are the sorts of things that might qualify as moral rules. And they're things that you cannot violate. Violating them under any circumstances is morally wrong. Obeying those rules is morally good. And so deontologists just think morality is a matter of following the right rules. That's all that matters. But like I said, it doesn't commit you to any one particular set of rules. So there are different ways to be a deontologist. There are different versions of deontology, different ethical theories or ethical views that qualify as a form of deontology. Because whatever your ethical view says the correct rules are, if your ethical view says following those rules is all that matters, then your view is deontological. It is a version or a form of deontology. The most common form of deontology is called Kantianism or Kantian ethics. And Kantianism is named after Immanuel Kant, the person I said a little bit ago, sort of caused the influence that deontologists often think intentions matter. That was Kant's influence. And so Immanuel Kant, whose picture you can see here, was a German philosopher, lived 1724 to 1804, and wrote about ethics and also about metaphysics. And some people have called him a forefather to cognitive science. He argued that space and time were in our minds. They're not in the world. They're not mind-independent parts of the world, independent of us. They are things that our mind applies to the world. And so they're in some sense in our minds. We spacify and timeify the world as we perceive it, was more or less Kant's view. Kant developed his philosophical theories by trying to analyze how we reason and how we conceptualize the world, what our concepts are that we use to perceive and think about the world. And that's why he's sometimes called a forefather of cognitive science. And he created a system of ethics that is now called Kantianism, named after him. Kantianism, or Kant's ethics, is a version of deontology that's based on rationality and on duty. So these are sort of the two core concepts that are important for Kant's ethics. Kant wants to know what we're morally obligated to do. What are our moral duties or our moral obligations? He thinks that's the important sort of part of ethics, is the stuff you have to do, the stuff you're morally obligated to do, the stuff it's your duty to do. And so he wants to know what our moral obligations are. But there's a question, how do you discover what your moral obligations are? You can't perceive them, you can't measure them. Moral obligations aren't something you can go like find and point at the way you can find and point at like owls and squirrels and buildings. They're not physical. An obligation is not a physical thing. You can't see it, you can't perceive it, so you got to figure it out by thinking about it. And Kant thinks that we can discover what's right and wrong simply by using reason, by thinking rationally and making valid, sound, good arguments. We can figure out what's morally right and what's morally wrong. And he thinks thinking rationally about morality will lead us to the right answer. And he thinks that our duties are our moral obligations that are imposed on us by rationality alone. So Kant thinks that we reason, we think, and we're capable of thinking rationally, logically, and that fact about us is enough to impose moral obligations on us. He thinks if we just think rationally, we'll realize that that rationality forces us to act ethically. That when we act ethically, we are acting irrationally. And once we see that, rationality will force us to start behaving rationally. And therefore, to start behaving ethically or morally well, morally good. And he thinks we'll also discover the correct answer to all ethical questions. So that's neat. Who doesn't want to know the right answer to all the questions? So Kant thinks duty is the basis for morality. The only acts that have moral worth are those that are performed with regard to duty. So you have these moral obligations, but also, in order for your action to really be morally good, you have to perform that action because it's your moral obligation. You have to perform it out of your sense of moral duty. Doing it because you have a moral obligation makes it morally good. If you did something not because it was morally right and you recognize that, but because you wanted to anyway, then that action doesn't really have moral worth. If you donate money not because you think you have an obligation to or because you know that it will help, but because it makes you feel good when you donate it. If that's why you donated money, because it made you feel good, Kant thinks that action doesn't really have moral worth. That's you making yourself feel good. That's not a morally valuable, that's not really a morally good action. For an action to really be morally good, you have to do it because you recognize that you have a moral duty to do that. Whether that's helping someone or donating money or telling someone the harsh truth when you don't want to, whatever it might be, you have to do it out of a sense of duty for it to be really morally good on Kant's view. Because Kant's a deontologist, which means he thinks that following moral rules is all that matters in morality. That is the core thing to being a morally good person, is obeying the moral rules. And so Kant thinks that you only really get moral credit for something if you were doing it because it follows the moral rules, or because it would violate moral rules not to do it. Doing something out of kindness or sympathy isn't really morally good. It doesn't give you any moral credit, for lack of a better phrase, uh, because you're not doing it for the right reasons. You need to be doing it out of a sense of duty. You can't just be doing it because of your own personal desires or emotions or whatever. And this is why intentions are important in Kantian ethics. Intentions matter. And intentions matter because you only get moral credit if you had the right intentions. It's only really morally good if your intention was to fulfill your moral obligation. If your intention was to follow the moral rules and do what the moral rules say you have to do. Those are the only morally good actions. So why you did it matters. It's not just that you followed the rules. It's that you followed them because you recognized you had an obligation to follow them. So it doesn't just matter what you did, it matters why you did it, on Kant's view. And so Kant thinks that duty is the core concept in morality, that we need to understand what our moral duties are. And Kant thinks these duties come from rationality. Rationality is how we discover the moral duties, but it's also what imposes these moral duties, these moral obligations on us. So duties arise because not following them, not obeying these duties, not following these rules, would lead to a contradiction. We would end up both wanting something and not wanting it. We would end up believing it and not believing it. We'd end up thinking something was both true and also false. And that's not possible. It's irrational to accept a contradiction, Kant thinks. So it's irrational not to follow and obey your moral duties. And so if violating your moral duty forces you to accept a contradiction, and it's irrational to accept a contradiction, that means violating your moral duties forces you to be irrational. You can't be fully rational and immoral. Kant thinks you can't be both rational and immoral. It just doesn't work. Behaving immorally means being irrational. Violating your moral duty means accepting contradictions and violating rational thought. And that's bad. And so Kant thinks that rationality imposes these moral obligations on us because we just are rational beings. And we can't, as rational beings, we can't accept a contradiction. And so failing to live up to our moral obligations forces us to accept a contradiction. Accepting a contradiction is irrational. So failing to live up to our moral obligations is irrational. Being rational means obeying our moral obligations. Not obeying our moral obligations would be irrational. So if we want to be rational, or if we just are rational, then we are compelled by that rationality to obey our moral obligations, to fulfill our moral duties, to follow the moral rules. And so for Kant, if something is immoral, then there's a proof that believing it, or believing that this immoral thing is okay, that would lead to a contradiction. So, for example, Kant thinks we have a duty not to break promises. And he thinks that we have this duty because the claim it's okay to break promises leads to a contradiction. if you think it is morally okay to break promises, then you have implicitly accepted a contradiction. You may not realize that's what you've done, but that's what you've done. So here's a sort of little mini proof that it's okay to break promises leads to a contradiction. Well, the point of a promise is that it guarantees that you will do whatever you promise to do. Right? That's what a promise is. It's you making a guarantee that you'll do whatever you promised you would do. But if it is okay to break promises, then a promise does not guarantee that you'll do whatever you promise to do, because you might break it, because it's okay to break promises. So if it's okay to break promises, then there's really no such thing as a promise. A promise is just a guarantee that you'll do what you said you'd do. But if it's okay to break promises, then promises don't guarantee that you'll do whatever you said you'd do. So a promise isn't really a promise if it can be broken. If it's okay to break promises, then there's really no such thing as a promise. But if there are no promises, then you can't break promises. Right? You can't break something that doesn't exist. That's just not possible. Something has to exist for you to break it. So if there are no promises, then you can't break promises. Therefore, if it is okay to break promises, then you can't break promises, because there's no such thing. And that's a contradiction. So if you say it's okay to break promises, then you are also saying that you can't break promises. And so you're saying that you both can and can't break promises. If you try to think that it's okay to break promises, you are on some level accepting that you can break promises and also accepting that you can't break promises. And that's a contradiction. You can't rationally think that you can and can't do something. You can't think that you can do it and also think that you can't do it at the same time. That's not an option. And so there's this contradiction that you can't rationally accept. And therefore, to think it's okay to break promises is irrational. Believing that means accepting a contradiction, which you can't rationally do. And since you can't rationally believe that it's okay to break promises, that means you have a duty to keep your promises. You have a moral obligation not to break your promises. As a rational being, as a rational agent is the phrase Kant uses, or the English translation of the German phrase Kant uses. As a rational agent, you cannot believe it's okay to break promises. And so rationality forces you not to break your promises, forces you to think it's not okay to break your promises. And that means, for Kant, that you have a moral duty to keep your promises. So for Kant, rationality gives us these rules, these duties, these obligations, that there are some things that it's just irrational to accept, like that it's okay to break promises. And if it's irrational to accept them, then we, as rational agents, cannot accept them. And so we cannot accept that it's okay to break promises, which means we are committed to the duty not to break promises. We're committed to not breaking our promises, since it's irrational to think we can break our promises. And so for Kant, rationality leads us to discover what he calls the categorical imperative, which is this very jargony term that Kant introduces, that is his word for like the big uber rule, the ultra moral rule that we have to obey, that all of our sort of smaller moral obligations fall out of. That rationality leads us to discover this imperative and then forces us to follow this imperative. So rationality pulls double duty. It's both how we find out about it and the thing that forces us to follow it. Right. So what is a categorical imperative? Well, an imperative is something that we must obey, something you have to do. If you think people in movies sometimes say, like, it is imperative that you do it as I say. It is absolutely imperative that we solve this problem immediately, or whatever. And that just means you have to do it. All they're saying is you have to do what I say, or we have to solve this problem immediately. Imperative just means something is necessary to do. It's just necessary. We got to do it. That's all imperative means. Grammatically, an imperative statement is a command like, shut up, quiet down, get out of here, come back to work, etc. Those are grammatically imperative statements because they're commands. They're things that you're saying someone has to do or things that you're telling someone to do. And so an imperative is something that you have to do. That's all imperative means in this context. And so the categorical imperative is an obligation that applies absolutely and unequivocally to everyone always, no matter what. Right? So categorical imperatives are these absolute and unconditional requirements for our actions. And they must be obeyed in all circumstances, not just when it's convenient, not just when you feel like it, not just when you have no better options that come to mind. It's always under any circumstances, no matter what. All circumstances, even when it absolutely sucks to have to do it, you still have to do it. So a categorical imperative is just something you have to obey no matter what, regardless of what your goals are, regardless of what you personally want, regardless of what's convenient. You have to do it at all times, regardless of the outcome that your obeying the imperative would bring about. You still have to obey the imperative. So following the rule, so we can think of the categorical imperative as just like a big rule, is necessary, full stop. And it's necessary regardless of what your goals are. And you can see why this counts as a form of deontology, because following this rule, this categorical imperative, is all that morality is, as far as Kant is concerned. And so obeying the moral rule is all that matters in morality. And that is classic deontology. And so you can't opt out of the categorical imperative. You have to obey the rule no matter what. And so Kant thinks that morality is a categorical imperative because it's placed on us by rationality. And you can't opt out of being a rational agent. You just are a rational agent. That is fundamentally what we as human beings are. We are things that make choices and think rationally. That's just what a human being is. If you're a person, then you are rational. You are a rational agent. And thus, if something is necessary for all rational agents, then it is necessary for you, because you are a rational agent. And there's no way for a person to stop being a rational agent. There's no way for a human being to give up their status as rational agent. So there's nothing you can do to opt out of following the categorical imperative. There are absolutely no exceptions, according to Kant. So since we're all rational and morality is forced on us by rationality, that means moral rules are categorical imperatives. They are rules that we have to follow all the time, everywhere, no matter what. They apply categorically. Think like when politicians are accused of something and they say, I categorically deny these allegations or something. They just mean, I deny them, absolutely no exceptions, full stop. They mean, they're saying there are no exceptions. I strongly deny this absolutely, no qualifications. And that's what a categorical imperative is. It's imperative categorically. It's something you have to do, absolutely no exceptions. And so the categorical imperative, this concept, is the core of Kant's moral philosophy. It is the central point. So what is it? What is the categorical imperative that we must obey? What is this one uber rule out of which all our other moral obligations fall? Well, Kant gives a couple different versions, like between 3 and 7, I think, depending on how you count them. But we'll only talk about one. It's the principle of ends in themselves. The principle of ends in themselves is this view that rationality forces us to treat people as ends in themselves rather than as mere means. So if something violates the principle of ends in themselves, then it is irrational and morally wrong. So Kant thinks the principle of ends in themselves is forced on us by rationality. Violating it is irrational and morally wrong. So we are all obligated, morally and rationally, to obey the principle of ends in themselves at all times. So what is the principle of ends in themselves? Well, put as simply as possible, the principle of ends in themselves says it is not permissible to use human beings as mere means. You always have to treat people as ends in themselves. So there are means and there are ends, right? You've heard the phrase, the ends justify the means, I assume, which just means that the goal here, the goal we're working towards, justifies the maybe questionable methods we've used to reach that goal. So the end or an end is just a goal that you have, and the means is the tool or method you use to reach that goal. So to use someone as a mere means is to treat them as merely a means for your own ends. It means you treat them as nothing more than a tool for reaching your own goals. You treat them as sort of inanimate tools in your own story, as tools for you to get what you want, with no regard for what they want. But to treat someone as an end in themselves is to treat them as a rational agent with their own goals. And ends in them, treat people as ends in themselves means treat them as their own agent with their own goals. Treat them as though they have their own ends, their own goals that they are working towards and entitled to pursue. Because they are. That is what they are. That is what people are. People are rational agents. They have their own goals. They can pursue those goals. And you need to treat them that way. It's irrational not to. It's just an error to treat a person as mere means because they aren't mere means. They are ends in themselves. A person is a conscious agent with their own goals and desires. To treat them otherwise is not just morally wrong, but factually wrong. You're treating them as though they don't have their own goals, when in fact they do. And so to treat someone as an end in themselves, you have to treat them as a full person, as an agent with their own goals, and you have to take their desires and goals into account. That doesn't mean you have to work tirelessly to further their desires and goals. You can't spend your entire life working to further every other person's goals because there are just more people than there are hours in a lifetime. That wouldn't work, just math. But in everything you do, you have to recognize that other people have their own goals, and you have to treat them as such and take those into account. Which means you can use people as means, but not mere means. Meaning you can use people to further your own goals, as long as in doing so, you aren't treating them as though they have no goals of their own, as though they aren't a full person. It's easier to go by example here. So let's look at an example. So you go to the bank, right? You go to the bank and you cash a check or you deposit a check into your account. When you do that, you use the bank teller as a tool to get your check deposited, right? In that case, in that scenario, the bank teller is the means by which you get your check deposited if you go into the bank and do it in person. But in doing so, you recognize that they are consenting to be there and to play a role in this transaction, and that they're, in some sense, using you as a tool to earn their paycheck. They're at the bank because they need income to pay rent and pay for food and stuff. And so they need customers at the bank and to help customers with their problems in order to earn their income. So in some sense, the bank teller's using you as a means to get their own goals met, to earn an income, to pay rent and whatnot. That's why they're helping you with your goals. And you both know that, you understand it implicitly. You both recognize that you probably wouldn't go to that bank if you thought the bank tellers were being held against their will. Uh, and Kant thinks these kinds of cases are absolutely morally fine. Uh, you're using the bank teller as a means to your end. The bank teller's using you as a means to their ends. But you both recognize that that's what's happening. You both consent to this, and you both agree to participate in this exchange, in this interaction, because it's to your mutual benefit. It helps further both of your goals, your goals and the bank teller's goals. So that's using someone as a means without using them as a mere means. To use someone as a mere means to use them as a tool for your plan in a way that they cannot in principle consent to. Right? Because the bank teller didn't say, like, hey, I just want you to know, I consent to help you with depositing your check. That's probably not how the bank conversation normally starts, because it's just sort of known and understood. If you were to ask them, hey, do you agree to help me with this? They would say yes. And you know that, and they know that. And so it's okay. You're not using them as a mere means. To use someone as a mere means means using them as a tool for your goals in a way that they cannot in principle consent to. So, for example, deceiving someone. To deceive someone, they cannot know that they are being deceived. Therefore, they cannot consent to being deceived. If someone knows that they are being deceived, then the deception has failed. They are not actually deceived. If you lie to someone and they know you're lying to them, then the lie failed. It didn't work because they don't believe your lie. For a lie to work, the other person, the person you're lying to, has to believe that it's the truth. So if someone knows they're being lied to, then they have not been successfully lied to. A lie only works if the other person believes it. And they only believe it if they don't know that it's a lie. So a lie only works if the other person doesn't know they're being lied to. And so you can't, even in principle, consent to be lied to. That's not an option, because if you were to consent to be lied to, then you could not be successfully lied to. In order to consent to being lied to, you have to know that the other person's lying. And if you know the other person's lying, then they aren't successfully lying. So you can't deceive someone in a way they could consent to. once they know, in order to consent, they have to know that they're being deceived. But once they know they're being deceived, they automatically can't be deceived. To be deceived, they have to not realize that they are being deceived. There's no deception there if they know what's going on and they know the truth. So the principle of ends in themselves says you cannot deceive anyone. If your plan calls for deceiving someone, whether that's lying to them or tricking them in some other way, whatever the deception is, if your plan calls for deceiving somebody, then your plan uses that person as a mere means. Your plan uses them in a way they cannot consent to, because no one can consent to being deceived. And your plan is therefore immoral. Any plan that involves deception is immoral on Kant's view. Any deception violates the principle of ends in themselves and is therefore immoral. And so this is why lying is wrong. Kant thinks that lying is morally wrong because to lie to someone is to deceive them and therefore to treat them as a mere means. So you can't lie to someone and also treat them as an end in themselves. By lying to them, you have disregarded their own goals and their need to understand the truth in order to pursue those goals. And you have treated them as a mere means, as nothing more than a tool for your own benefit. And therefore, on Kant's view, you have a moral obligation not to lie. Any lying is immoral. And so that's one of the moral rules of Kantian ethics is not lying. There is a rule against lying. And so Kant thinks categorical imperative gives us the principle of ends in themselves. Principle of ends in themselves gives us a rule never to lie. And so we have this obligation never to lie. And it is always obligatory. It is always necessary for us to follow it. We have to obey the rule at all times, no matter what. It is never morally permissible to use someone as a mere means. And so it's never morally permissible to lie. It is always morally wrong to lie. And this is when Kant says that he's not kidding. This is the murder at the door case, which is a sort of a hypothetical scenario that Kant himself raises. So suppose there's a murderer who's chasing a victim. They're trying to murder somebody. They're chasing their murder victim or their would-be murder victim. And you know where the victim went. Maybe you're hiding the victim for them. And suppose the murderer asks you, where did my victim go? I've been chasing this person to kill them. I want to know where they went. Where are they? Kant thinks you have to tell the truth to the murderer in that case. You have to say, oh, yes, right this way, and direct them. You have to tell them the truth. Kant thinks you cannot lie to the murderer at the door. Even though it will save a life, you cannot violate the no lying rule. It would be morally wrong to lie to the murderer, even though lying to the murderer would save a life. That's Kant's view. So Kant thinks you still can't break the rules, no matter how bad the consequences of following those rules will be. You have a moral obligation to follow the moral rules at all times. Any instance of breaking the moral rules is morally wrong. Even if breaking a rule means saving a life, even if people will die because you told the truth, Kant thinks you still have a moral obligation to tell the truth. And so that's the difference between deontology, which we've been talking about in this video, and consequentialism, which we're going to talk about in the next video. Consequentialism, as you're about to see, only cares about consequences. But deontology, like Kant's view, doesn't care about consequences at all. Uh, there's a quote from someone or other that says, may right be done though the heavens may fall, or something, that basically means do the right thing even if the world comes crashing down around you because of it. And that's kind of the essence of Kant's view, and to a lesser extent, deontology in general. It's that you have to follow the moral rules, no matter how bad the consequences of following those rules might be. If there's a moral rule not to lie, then you cannot lie, even if it would save a life. Even if telling the truth means a murderer murders someone, you still have to tell the truth. You can't break the rule even to save a life. In Kant's view, you can't treat anyone as ends in themselves. It's always morally wrong to treat someone, you must treat everyone as ends in themselves. Important distinction. You must treat everyone as ends in themselves. You can never treat someone as a mere means. Even if that person is a murderer trying to murder someone, a murderer in the process of trying to commit murder, you still have to treat that murderer as an end in themselves. You have to treat the murderer as a rational agent with their own goals. You cannot treat the murderer as a mere means, even if it means saving a life. So you have to treat everyone as ends in themselves, even if they're about to murder someone. You have to obey the moral rules, no matter who, what, when, where, or why. And that is a feature of deontology. Morality comes down to whether or not you are obeying the moral rules, and that's all there is to it. And so this is all I wanted to talk about with deontology and with Kantianism. So this is sort of the downside, I guess you could say, of deontology, is that you have to obey moral rules. We think oftentimes of morality in terms of rules, which makes sense. So it has some appeal, but you cannot violate the rules, even if it would be way better for everybody if you would just break the rule. It's still morally wrong to break the rule, according to deontology. So you might think, well, okay, so rules is the wrong way to go. Instead, we should look at consequences. And that is what we will look at in the next video when we talk about consequentialism. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.